appointing a Putin-approved government in Kyiv, we describe it as regime change. It also seeks Ukrainian demilitarization so that, in the Kremlin's words, Ukraine can no longer threaten Russia. And lastly, Ukraine must never join NATO, and no NATO forces can ever be stationed there. All objectives again restated in Istanbul, according to the Russian media. These two positions, as often but not always the case in war, are diametric opposites. On one hand, Ukraine seeks restoration of its sovereignty and guarantees of future security. On the other, Russia seeks to remove that sovereignty and render Ukraine defenseless. To achieve peace, there's going to have to be compromise, a significant compromise on both sides. But that's just the stated goals. A quick look at Russian media or a survey of Putin's comments to a domestic audience indicate that Russia's real goals might be much, much wider. The political discourse there is full of restoring Russia's status as a global power, of rebuilding the Soviet empire, of turning Berlin, Paris, London into rubble, of being an equal to the United States. Margarita Simonian, the editor-in-chief of state-owned Russia Today, talks openly of the necessity for and inevitability of future war. That Russia's military is the only tool it has to restore its power and its glory. That Russia's economic future depends on greater military spending, not less. But Russia's war economy should be permanent. Melbourne-based commentator and my friend Michael Lavrivsky has spoken at AIIA Victoria about how Putin's worldview goes back deep into history, to the myth of the establishment of Kievan Rus and the formation of the Russian Orthodox Church in 988 AD. And he's motivated by a deep sense of historic destiny. In this misreading of history, Ukraine is Russia, has no separate identity. Lavrivsky further explains the genocidal nature of Russia's Ukraine project to eliminate completely Ukrainian culture, language, identity. If Ukraine loses this war, it ceases to exist. Now, anyone who managed to stay awake through the whole 3 hours of Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin will understand that Putin truly believes this stuff. He's deeply motivated by destiny, hence frequent references to Peter the Great, the glories of Russian history, religion, culture. If this is true, if Russia's real aims are more to do with restoration of status and some mythical historic destiny, then what they're seeking has got little to do with the Donbass or any particular Ukrainian town. Instead, the Kremlin's objective is deeper, wider, and relates to Russia's place in history. It involves rewriting the global order and establishing Russian supremacy in Europe. And they see the principal obstacle to that objective lying not in Ukraine, but in NATO. Now, it's possible that this historic destiny narrative, the narrative the Kremlin pushes at home, is simply a device to sustain domestic support for the war. And that, when push comes to shove, the Kremlin will only be interested in achieving narrower goals in Ukraine. I really, really don't think so. So let's return to our model of how wars end: compromise, coercion, military situation, international pressure, domestic politics. Now, the military situation at a macro level has remained largely unchanged for 18 months. Over this period, neither side is anything close to achieving their objectives. Yes, Russia continues to make advances in the Donbass, but slowly and at great cost. Last year, Russia seized around 4,000 square kilometers of Donetsk Oblast. At this rate, it will take another 2 years to capture the rest of this one oblast, let alone the much larger areas of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, which remain under Ukrainian control. And although counterfeit figures in this war are unreliable, difficult to verify, it does look as though Russian casualties are either nearing or over the 1 million mark. 1 million deaths and seriously injured. The Ukrainian General Staff estimate that Russian casualties for last year, 2024, as 420,000. On the Ukrainian side, apart from the ultimately doomed offensive in Kursk, Ukrainians remain on the strategic defensive. The stronger form of war, of course, but one that does little to recapture lost territory. Drone attacks on Russian strategic bombers may capture headlines, but they won't change the course of the war, not by themselves. As in most wars, there are no silver bullets, no magic solutions that suddenly change everything. Instead, wars are usually determined by a combination of multiple actions that eventually allow one side to start winning irrevocably and the other side to start losing also irrevocably. We're a long way from that. So the attack on Russian strategic bombers needs to be seen in this light. It'll reduce slightly the intensity of Russian strategic missile attack, not eliminate it. But that slight reduction, together with everything else happening, might possibly contribute to something more significant in the longer term. I'll talk at the end about how this current situation might evolve. But right now, the military situation is largely stalemated. So now let's talk about the international dimension, in particular, the West's support for Ukraine. Putin hopes, as he's done since the first day of the war, that the West will become bored with supporting Ukraine. He recently restated that Ukraine wouldn't last 2 months without Western support. But European allies appear to be becoming more determined, not less. And although US support is less certain than it was before, it's also less important than it was before. Every month, Ukrainian defense industry becomes stronger, partly due to significant investment by European states and partnerships with European defense manufacturers. Just last weekend, for example, French car manufacturer Renault announced a new consortium to build drones in Ukraine. Ukraine's already on track to build 1.8 million drones this year. Ukrainian domestic production now supplies 40% of all its weapons. Europeans provide another 40%, the US the remaining 20%. That's not to say that American support isn't important. It is. The US alone, for example, builds Patriot missiles, critical for the air defense of Kyiv. Intelligence support, American intelligence support, especially satellite surveillance, is equally critical for early warning of Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. That's the main reason why Zelensky goes to such extraordinary lengths to placate Trump and keep him on board. As an aside, the growth of Ukrainian defense industry is a measure of the failure of the Russian strategic bombing campaign. The Kremlin have focused more on destroying Ukrainian industry rather than attempting to terrorize the Ukrainian population by attacking the cities. The situation might be very different. Now, the Russians, of course, are equally reliant on international support. We've all seen Iranian drones, missiles attacking Ukraine, and North Korean troops played a significant part in defeating the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. North Korean artillery ammunition is hugely important in giving the Russians a local artillery advantage for their attacks. Well, the main question is, and always has been, China. China buys the lion's share of Russia's oil and gas exports at a highly discounted price. It provides about 80% of all the electronics required for Russian weapons. It sells dual-use drones to whoever will buy them, including, of course, Russia. But what we haven't seen, or at least I haven't seen, is any evidence of Chinese weapons or ammunition being supplied to the Russians. And it really is pretty easy to detect when it happens. So I think, for now, the Chinese position is being perfectly content to make money out of Russia's dependence on them. They're content as Russia becomes weaker and weaker. They probably don't want to see an outright American victory if that's going to occur, but they don't seem to be doing anything significant that would enable Putin to achieve Russian victory. So let's turn to the third influence on the coercion compromise equation, domestic politics. On the Ukrainian side, the population continues to be stalwart in its rejection of compromise to end the war. Last week, a new survey showed that over 60% of the population stated they should endure the war for as long as it's needed. Only 20% perceived that endurance as limited to months. That's the Ukrainians. Let's focus on the domestic situation in Russia, where the economy really is struggling, despite many Kremlin trolls claiming the opposite. Inflation is rampant, interest rates at a near historic high, shortage of workers, oil and gas income low, and chronic lack of investment in non-military parts of the economy. The implications to all of this, of course, implications of a war economy. One of them is collapsing critical infrastructure. For example, Russian railways, where loading capacity, the total amount of freight that can be moved by rail, loading capacity has reduced from a pre-war level of 3.5 million tons per day to around 3 million tons per day. So 15%, but actually that is significant. A reduction at least partly caused by non-availability of locomotives, 50% of which are well over 20 years old and becoming increasingly costly and difficult to maintain. And instead of investing in railways to buy new locomotives, the Russian government is taxing the railways more in order to fund the war. And a country the size of Russia, with poorly developed road network to its resource-rich hinterland, depends very much on railways for its economy to work. And this is just one industry. Now, last week, news, the Russian central bank lowered the interest rate from 21% to 20%. This despite inflation remaining at a very high figure of over 10%. In Russia, as everywhere else, interest rates are the principal mechanism that the central bank uses to control inflation. There's high inflation, interest rates raised to reduce the money in circulation and bring inflation down. We all know that. Now, there have been reports that the Kremlin has been pressuring the central bank to lower the base rate to encourage what is essentially a stagnating economy to grow. But even so, the reductions are surprising. Some economists suggest it indicates concern that money is drying up in Russia. With low income from oil and gas, the economy has largely been sustained by depleting the National Wealth Fund, widely predicted as to be down to zero by the end of this year. If that's the case, the argument goes, the National Wealth Fund can no longer sustain the war economy, then they need to grow the non-war parts of the economy by reducing interest rates to encourage borrowing and hence good investment. Now, I'm certainly not sure that a drop of 1% to 20 is going to make much difference. So we may yet see further base rate reductions. But of course, that will encourage even higher inflation, which over time will make everything more expensive and life more difficult for ordinary Russians. Now, although there are different views on the severity of the economic problems facing Russia, from imminent collapse to the idea that Russia is actually relatively immune from economic forces, most agree that Russia is near the brink of crisis, but not yet actually on it. Alexander Popenko of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center points out that Putin's current strategy is unsustainable. But she adds, it's unlikely to come to a head this year, and I quote, "Simmering economic problems are unlikely to overpower the forces that keep Putin bent on continuing the war. The possibility of popular pressure is low. For many Russians, dignity has come to mean state-provided salaries and pensions rather than political or civil liberties." Now, this is a really important insight. I'll repeat it. For many Russians, dignity comes from state-provided salaries and pensions rather than liberties. Now, returning to Popenko, public sentiment may change as inflation continues to bite. But the idea that Putin's wartime leadership means economic prosperity and national pride will be difficult to shake from the public consciousness. So there is a continuing acceptance of Putin and the war in the general populace of Russia. But yet, the war is unpopular. Earlier this year, Leonid Volkov of the Russian opposition movement, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, released polls that show anxiety levels in Russia are rising consistently. And then when asked to cite priorities for government funding, only 12% put military spending higher than education, pensions, and healthcare. But as another prominent Russian opposition figure, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, pointed out, Putin doesn't really care about that. He's not going to get any poorer. It's not his children who are being killed in Ukraine. He's not personally endangered by the Ukrainians. And as long as he can keep enough of the population quiet and sustain the organs of state oppression, then popular discontent is unlikely to force a change of Russian strategy this year or next. Not impossible, but unlikely. So Ukraine's strategy to cumulatively, continuously raise the human and economic costs to Russia of continuing this war, this is unlikely to cause Russia to falter, at least this year, and is unlikely to achieve their strategic objectives in even the medium term. It's possible the Putin regime may suddenly collapse, bringing to power a completely different government that voluntarily withdraws from Ukraine. And when dictators collapse, they usually do so with little warning. But as we've seen, in Russia, that's unlikely, at least in the short term. On the other side, it's possible that the West will suddenly give up and Putin can win a military victory, especially given Trump's inconsistency. But it seems unlikely, at least in the short term. To all intents and purposes, it looks very much like a classic case of mutually hurting stalemate. Neither side achieving their goals, and continuing the war is painful for both. Back in January, when Trump came to power, I thought he might be right, that now is the time to make peace between Ukraine and Russia. But nothing is simple. As my colleague from Oxford, Professor Sir Hugh Strawn, once observed in the context of the First World War, the greater the sunk cost, the higher the blood price paid, the more you need to demonstrate victory to prove it was all worth it. The more you paid, the less likely you are to compromise. It's illogical, given sunk cost theory, of course, but understandable on a human level. And it's certainly the case with Russia today. In the summer of 2022, for hundreds of thousands of deaths, for the emasculation of the Russian economy, Putin might have got away with freezing the war along the front line. But not now. Now, if he accepted American proposals on territory, he'd be widely regarded as being defeated. And even the Kremlin's propaganda machine would have difficulty portraying that as victory. So let's look at the peace process and try and understand what happened. The fact that the peace process occurred all at Trump's insistence that both sides understood that the USA had real power to change the course of the war. And this administration seemed to have the appetite to use that power in a way that Biden appeared too fearful to do. Now, any such attempted peace process, as with most efforts of persuasion, involved carrot and stick. For the Ukrainians, this meant the US withdrawal of military support. Unless keep compromises over territory, that's the main stick. As we've seen, the US is not Ukraine's largest supporter, but what they provide is critical. So what this stick threatens is Ukraine's defeat, and as we've seen, destruction as an independent country. Not in 2 months, as Putin hopes, but probably long drawn out, gradual erosion of Ukrainian capacity to resist. Now, the main carrot the Ukrainians were seeking clearly was a security guarantee to ensure that Russia never again would or could invade Ukraine. Now, for the Russians, the main stick the administration originally cited was that unless the Russians compromise, the US would ramp up support to Ukraine significantly. This might have ensured that the Kremlin couldn't achieve their objectives. What it would not do is threaten Putin's defeat. This is important. This is why it's been so easy for the Americans to coerce Zelensky to compromise, because they could threaten Ukraine's total destruction, but not Putin. Because the worst the Americans can threaten is to prevent Russian victory, not cause their defeat. The other aspect of the stick, of course, is economic, and Trump has sometimes threatened on social media increased sanctions and tariffs on Russian goods. But frankly, these have had little impact on the Russian economy, whose economic lifeline, slender as it is, lies now with China and India, not the USA and the West. But America has not used any of these sticks on Russia. Instead, it's offered only carrots, lifting sanctions and the promise of untold riches from trade deals with Russia. Professor Sir Lawrence Friedman describes what he calls Trump's two animating fallacies. First, that Putin wanted peace in the way that Trump wanted peace. And once peace was achieved, there are great economic deals to be done. Friedman goes on to say that Trump failed, but he never understood the underlying drivers of the conflict, for little more than territory, because he underestimated Ukraine's resilience. His own confidence in his personal combination of charm, bluster, and bullying proved to be totally unwarranted. While Trump sensed that it might help if Russia was put under more pressure, using American sticks rather than carrots, he could not bring himself to do so. We'll explore shortly why Trump appears to have such a blind spot over Putin. Now, throughout this process, neither Ukraine nor Russia wants to be seen as blocking peace. Neither wants to risk an American stick. So Zelensky agrees to nearly every proposal the US puts forward, whether it be a 30-day ceasefire, rare earth deals, concessions on territory, or that he personally go to Istanbul to talk to Putin, who of course didn't turn up. And it's also the reason why Putin sounds ever so reasonable in his telephone calls with Donald Trump, while simultaneously finding ever more reasons to delay. Because Putin doesn't want peace. He's had ample opportunity. But he needs to keep Trump thinking he does. He hopes eventually the US will get bored, cease supporting Ukraine, and walk away. And walk away is what Trump is doing. His metaphor last week was that the Russia-Ukrainian war was like two kids fighting in a park. And sometimes you just needed to let the kids fight it out. Of all the crass things that Trump has said, this is one of the worst. Zelensky's response was masterfully understated, despite his clear anger. Putin is no kid in the park. He's a murderer, and he's murdering children. But basically, as far as Trump's concerned, it's now up to Russia and Ukraine. The USA is no longer playing a major role in ending the Russia-Ukrainian war. Trump's most important foreign policy initiative in this second term has ended in failure. Now, I used to say that Trump was famously unpredictable, seemingly proud of it. Anything we might predict him to do, almost without warning, he could do the opposite. But he seems to become entirely predictable about Vladimir Putin. He's predictable in his refusal to blame Russia for the war. He's predictable in his refusal to apply further sanctions against Russia, whatever he tweets. He's predictable in claiming that Ukraine is largely to blame for the Russian invasion. He's predictable in repeating Russian propaganda narratives. Most recently, last week, he declined to side with German Chancellor Merz in a show of unity against Russia. And according to the Wall Street Journal, is pressuring Senator Lindsey Graham to water down his proposed sanctions bill against Russia. So why does Donald Trump appear to have such a blind spot when it comes to Putin and the Kremlin? To any rational Western observer, it should be easy to choose between Russia, supported by North Korea and Iran, and Ukraine, supported by nearly every decent democratic country on earth. Why does Trump not see this? Two possibilities are usually cited in the States. The first is that Trump is in some way attracted to the strongman Putin image and seeks to emulate the power of the dictator or the perverted image of masculinity that Putin represents. Potential evidence of this are the various AI-created images of Trump, which he himself has released or endorsed in various heroic masculine poses, from Star Wars characters wielding lightsabers to the Pope, or his apparent support for the extreme misogynism of the Tate brothers. His conversion of the Oval Office from a sober expression of American power to a temple of cheap bling, is this attempting to imitate the opulence of the Tsarist Kremlin palace, an illustration of the kind of president he'd like to be? Perhaps. The other potential reason often cited for Trump favoring Putin is that Putin has something on him. From his time, perhaps, of attempting to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, or something to do with benefiting from Russian interference in American elections. Yet, Trump's already been accused of corruption, bribery, rape, sexual abuse. He's a convicted felon. He was still elected as President of the United States of America. He appears extraordinarily waterproof against any kind of allegation, and instead almost thrives on it. So right now, we really don't know. What we do know is he doesn't read intelligence reports. Last week, the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, hired a Fox TV director to help her convert daily written intelligence reports, which Trump doesn't read, to a 10-minute, easy-to-watch TV show, which he might watch. So it's possible he simply doesn't know enough to make an informed judgment. And he's making major strategic decisions based on gut instinct of who he likes, who he dislikes, perhaps influenced by the echo chamber of his own social media feeds. And we know he follows a number of Russian supporters, if not Russian trolls. We've all seen that he likes and responds well to people who praise him, who agree with him, who are sycophants. And Vladimir Putin appears more adept at doing precisely that, praising him, than Volodymyr Zelensky. And it's possible that it's that which is driving American strategy on Ukraine, rather than any rational understanding of national interest. Whatever the reason, Trump leaves the war very largely as he found it. The war continues. So what's going to happen next? I must start by saying I never make predictions. War is notoriously unreliable, and anyone who claims to know how this or any war will end simply should not be trusted. But what we can do is look at trends, identify possibilities. Now, last month, the leader of the Russian delegation at the Istanbul talks, Vladimir Medinsky, told the Ukrainians, "We don't want war, but we're ready to fight for a year, 2, 3, however long it takes. We fought Sweden for 21 years. How long are you ready to fight?" He was citing, of course, the Great Northern War fought against Sweden between 1700 and 1721. He was making the point that Russians would fight forever until they achieved their victory. He was reinforcing a Russian narrative that victory is inevitable, that Russia never loses, and the Ukraine should surrender now to spare themselves more pain to come. This narrative dominates social media discourse, especially in the United States, promoted heavily by Russian trolls and bots. Of course, it's not true. The Russians often lose. After the Japanese Navy of 1904, the German Army of 1917, Turks, French and British of 1856, or the Peshmerga of Afghanistan. There's absolutely no certainty to Russian victory in Ukraine. In fact, I think it very unlikely. It would need not just the US to withdraw all its support from Ukraine, but Europe too. Highly unlikely, as we've seen. It would need a collapse of Ukrainian national will. Again, possible, but also unlikely. It would need the Russian army to find a level of competence which, after 3 years, has so far eluded them. And it would need the Russians to significantly expand their armed forces to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses. Russian stocks of old Soviet equipment have already very largely been used up. Their ability to create new formations is now limited to what they can manufacture or import, both impacted by sanctions and both costing scarce money. On Monday, NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte said that the Russian defense industry was now manufacturing every year 1,500 tanks, 3,000 other armored vehicles, and 200 Iskander missiles. He's surely right about the Iskanders, but analysts think he's misinterpreted the armored vehicle data he's been given. The 1,500 tanks he cites are not new, but the total of new production, rehabilitated hulks from storage, and repaired tanks from the battlefield. The number of new tanks that Russia's producing is actually in the low hundreds. And since the war started per year, they've lost 4,030 tanks as of today, all visually confirmed. So the real figure of losses is likely to be much higher. One by one, Russia's strategic advantages are being eroded. Black Sea Fleet defeated. The Russian Air Force, one of its major strategic advantages, now has to contend with NATO standard air-to-air missiles, fired by NATO standard fighters, guided by NATO standard airborne early warning On Saturday, a Russian Su-35 was shot down by an F-16 at long range well inside Russia. The first time, I think, since early in the war, the Ukrainian Air Force has been able to contest air control using its own fighters. Manpower is often cited as another Russian strategic advantage. Russia has unlimited manpower, the narrative goes, while Ukraine's running out. On the 13th of May, Putin claimed that Russian voluntary recruitment in 2025 this year runs at 50 to 60,000 per month, well above the target of around 400,000 for the year. But according to the US-based Institute for the Study of War, these figures are exaggerated. The total of enlistment bonuses paid across the Russian regions, and the people who count these things, indicate that the true figure of enlistments is about 2/3 of what Putin claims. And if recruitment centers are so overwhelmed with volunteers, why are the Russian regions offering ever higher financial inducements to persuade people to join when money is in such short supply? This appears to be just another arm of the propaganda narrative that Russia is so strong that victory is inevitable. Of course, Ukraine has problems recruiting enough people too. It's not a one-sided issue. We've seen that. Ukraine reliance on drones is partly a consequence of not having enough people to man defenses. And lack of defenders appears to be a major reason why Russia continues to make territorial gains, however slowly, however expensively. And there comes a stage in the battle when Ukrainian commanders have decided between conserving their people and trading their territory. And they have to conserve their people. Even Russia's sheer size, the largest country on earth, seems to count against it, as Ukrainian drones evade Russian air defenses and attack unguarded industrial and military facilities deep, far in the Russian rear. Russians cannot defend everywhere. So I think Russian military victory is highly unlikely, and will become increasingly unlikely over time which the Russian economy becomes weaker, as long as the sanctions regime remains in place, and jeopardizes Russia's ability to continue the war. And as both Ukrainian and European defense capability and capacity become stronger to offset any remaining advantages that Russia has in numbers. I'm not sure that Putin sees like this. I suspect he believes that time is on his side, as long as his economists continue somehow to balance the books. Not only does he believe Trump will walk away, he also despises what he regards as weak Europeans, gay Europeans. And his generals and ministers tell him what they think he wants to know about the war. So he probably thinks he's still winning, and it's just a matter of time. Which, as I hope is obvious by now, it's not. Does that mean the Russians will lose? I don't know. There's a great difference between not winning and losing. It's difficult to visualize the Ukrainian armed forces ever being strong enough to overwhelm Russian defenses. They don't have the luxury of being able to lose nearly 1 million people just to capture a few thousand square kilometers. It's possible, of course, over time, the stability of the regime will begin to be threatened in a way that's difficult to visualize right now. Economic hardship caused by the war might impact living conditions to such an extent that Alexander Papenko's statement about Russian dignity coming from state pensions and salaries might no longer be true if those salaries and pensions are no longer being paid or are not enough to feed the family. Or the level of casualties might become such that society isn't prepared to tolerate them anymore. Remember, the Russian war in Afghanistan ended largely because of pressure from soldiers' mothers. And in 1917, it was the army itself that brought about revolution, at least partly caused by high casualties on the battlefront. Now, of course, Putin controls the security apparatus that keeps him in power and people in check. While that remains, dissent is dangerous. All it takes for a regime to collapse is for security forces to refuse to shoot their own people. That's why the Iron Curtain fell. And one of the most interesting sights of the Prigozhin rebellion was that all security agencies standing to one side, just letting Wagner march on Moscow unimpeded. So I suspect Putin must be worried, even if he never tells Donald Trump. Now, usually, when people forecast the end of the Putin regime, and one day it will end, for absolute certain, but when they do, people predict more of the same. A similarly authoritarian, male, misogynistic, imperialistic figure who will lead Russia down the same path. So it's perhaps even more aggressive, more dangerous to its neighbors. But Russia doesn't have to be like this. There's nothing in Russian DNA that means they have to be aggressively imperialistic, any more than there was nothing in the German DNA in 1945 that meant they had to be Nazis. Few predicted then that Germany would become a bedrock of European democracy. Yeah, it takes imagination to visualize a different Russia, democratic Russia. Yes, you need to be an optimist. And no, it may not be likely, but it is possible. And there are plenty of optimists in the Russian opposition who believe precisely in that possibility. Different Russia, a Russia at peace with its neighbors, a Russia that becomes the final European state to embrace democracy and belief in human decency. That's what Alexei Navalny believed in. It's why he was killed. And it's what his widow, Yulia Navalny, now head of Navalny's opposition organization, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, what she believes in. And AWI Victoria very much hopes to bring Yulia to Australia in September to help explain to Australians what that future could look like, what we might have to do to help bring it about. But for a different Russia to be even possible, first, Putin needs to be stopped in Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Certainly a masterful overview of the war. And we will take questions now. Now, we haven't got terribly long, so if you can, please make your questions concise and to the point, and no statements. Thanks. Just short questions. First, over there.
Thanks very much. I was just wondering if you could make the link between the Ukraine-Russia war and Australia's strategic position now.
I'm often asked that, of course, and as though it's not precisely the topic of this talk, it's obviously germane. The generally accepted view is that, and I think there is a lot of merit in this view, is that the principal impact of that war has got to be seen through its influence on what China is going to do as a result. The general view is that if Putin gets away with this, it would encourage Xi to do the same policy. But I think there's more layers than that in terms of what China's about. And its relationship with Russia, I think, is hugely important. And how that evolves on Monday or Tuesday, on Monday, a FSB report was leaked describing how the Russian intelligence regards China as a threat. And there is considerable concern over Russia's continued and ever-increasing reliance upon China. Personally, I'm not sure. I find it that could possibly be a deliberate leak to feed into a particular right-wing American view that they should be attempting to split Russia and China and use Russia as an ally in its potential conflict with China. And so my suspicious mind is actually that leak was deliberately founded or created in order to strengthen that right-wing American view that they should compromise with Russia and force Ukraine to surrender. So I'm not entirely sure, but nevertheless, that will impact it. My own view, which is slightly different from that sort of general understanding, is more to do with philosophy and our role as a successful liberal democracy in our region. And I do genuinely believe that when liberal democracy is under threat, we need, across the world, we need to be standing up more for what we stand for. And supporting Ukraine against an authoritarian dictatorship is a hugely important part of that. That's my opinion.
One second, there's one online.
We have a question online. Thank you, Richard. And this is a question from Penelope, and she said that you've mentioned both China and India being economic lifelines for Russia. Can you tell us a little bit more about India's position?
India's position.
Yes.
India, like China, actually seeks to make money out of this war because Russia is hugely reliant on them both to export their oil and gas because of sanctions to the rest of the world almost. And so India is receiving hugely discounted oil and making money out of this. Like China, there has been no evidence of Indian military support or logistic support for Russia. India has refused to pay, which Russia wants them to do, to pay rubles. So they pay in a mixture of yuan and Emirati dirhams. And that, of course, makes life difficult for Russia because essentially the ruble has stopped being traded. So I think India is just doing what is best for India rather than taking sides.
This was here that you were first. Oh, no, what's your turn? It's all right. Be quick, be concise.
To talk about Russian imperialism in Ukraine, do you think that the US might have its own imperialist ambitions, considering they just constantly talk about critical minerals? There's an infamous leaked phone call where they're talking about who they want to put in charge next after 2014, and they've conducted a lot of military exercises on Russia's
Do
border.
you mind if I pass on that question? Because I don't know, because I mean, my views were exactly the same as yours.
Right.
Who knows? Who knows? It looks like.
Well, can I take issue with you about your optimism on peace with Putin? Here's a Russian leader from central casting, whether it's Tsars or whether it's Stalinist communist dictatorships. If he compromises, he gets removed and he dies. What is the hope for Russian people and if we lose Putin, do we get someone worse? What really is the hope that they will compromise?
What I'm going to quote is Leonard Volkov, who's Navalny's chief of staff, and this was Navalny's view of trying to chart a way to democracy in Russia. And it goes back to Putin's leadership style and capability, where in order to ensure that he is not challenged, he divides power and authority across Russia so that no individual has more than 10% of the power that he has. No individual has power across more than one silo of economic security. And as a result, there are no obvious candidates to replace Putin. The last time this happened was the death of Stalin. When Stalin died, there was a scramble for power, which lasted 5 years until Khrushchev finally became the first secretary. In that 5 years, German prisoners of war, we're now talking about mid-50s, were eventually released to go back to Germany. Soviet forces withdrew from Austria. There was a lot of chaos and potential for even more. So what Volkov said or suggested that, yeah, there's bound to be strong men, Putin lookalikes, who will struggle for power. But it's not beyond the realm of possibility that one of those people, might well pick up the phone to the White House and say, I think we might be able to control our nuclear weapons, but I'm going to need your help. And it's possible that after a struggle, that they might end up in a completely different place from where they are now. Who knows? I said it wasn't likely, but it is possible.
I just wanted to touch on when Wagner was marching towards Moscow, it seemed like a massive development at the time, and security forces were standing aside. I'm just curious as to how is that not more capitalized on by Ukraine and Ukrainian allies, and how did that not cause more of a significant problem in Russia and seemed almost completely gone away when at the time it seemed like this is the golden ticket to causing disruption in Russia? What happened more?
You're right, it did, didn't it? And yet it has, because of the way that he dealt with it, it's ended up apparently solidifying his control rather than undermining it. I don't know. The Ukraine, of course, is very limited in what it could do, and I suspect they just rather hope for more. I'm sorry, not much of an answer, but I don't think there is an answer.
So our last question now.
Oh, thank you, Richard. Great call. Putin's playing a long game, and he's a master at the long game. What does the rise of the right in those adjoining countries to both Ukraine and Russia put at risk over time?
My own view is that as long as the Baltic states, as long as Poland, as long as Germany, France, and Britain are all robust, then actually we've got a core of support for Ukraine. As it is, we've got a lot more than that, including Turkey, which I think is also really important. And Italy, which is surprising, bearing in mind it is a right-wing government. The main problem, of course, with Hungary and Slovakia is that they are NATO members and EU members with the potential veto. So far, both the NATO and the EU have finding ways to get around that particular opposition. Initially by inducements, now other ways, by sticks rather than carrots. So I'm not sure. I think if there is a continual slide to the right across the border countries, right, it might well have an impact. But recent elections, including Moldova, actually show a slight strengthening of the anti-Russian movement, despite an enormous propaganda effort from the Kremlin.
Thank you very much. It was great. Paul, you should say a few words.
I've just already got our announcements of what's coming up.
We got the next week, we got the Colombo flag.
Yes.
And then the one after that.
After that, we have an event with the High Commissioner of India,
Yeah, that's July.
Parliament Health,
What that's it.
at the 8th of July.
Right. Hello, sorry about that. First of all, Richard, thank you for terrific.
Oh, thank you.
We've got a whole lot of things that are really interesting coming up. Next week, our youth board is running an event on the New Colombo program of particular interest to our younger members, but those of the rest of us who might celebrate, in fact, the tremendously successful program that was reinvigorated, interestingly, by Tony Abbott, is worthwhile coming along to. Well, he did the right thing in doing it. And then after that, we have the Indian High Commissioner on the
8th of July.
8th of July, and we have Malcolm Turnbull, who is speaking at our annual dinner on the
20th of August.
20th of August.
20th of August. Thank you, and that will be at Tattersalls, and that will be Malcolm is more than happy to speak his mind, and that will be a tremendously interesting event for us all to attend. So a lot of things coming up. Have a look on the website. But again, it is so good to have our Victorian colleague Richard Iron here. So erudite, so interesting. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your questions from the audience. Thank you online. And now we'll have a little bit of hospitality, I think.